Ransomware went from one of those threats that emerged in kind of like the mid to late 2010s. And it was kind of an issue kind of running in the background. But actually it went really quickly from one of those cybercrime problems that perhaps wasn't an enormous priority for us in law enforcement, all the way through to being a national security issue and the most significant cybersecurity issue faced in the UK in a relatively short period of time.
Hello, and welcome to Public Key. This is your host, Ian Andrews. If you don't follow cybersecurity news closely, you might reasonably have the impression that the bad guys always win. A week doesn't go by without a headline about a big company getting shut down by ransomware or yet another data breach. And last year, over $1 billion was paid by ransomware victims to the bad guys. That seems like a pretty clear scoreboard, right? Well, it turns out the good guys have had quite a few dramatic wins recently. And this week, I'm excited to speak to William Lyne, who's head of cyber intelligence at the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom, and my colleague Phil Larratt, who's director of investigations for Chainalysis. Will shares the inside story behind the UK law enforcement infiltration and takedown of LockBit, who until the takedown was one of the most prolific ransomware as a service providers we've ever seen. The effort was dubbed Operation Cronos, and it took a coordinated effort across a large number of law enforcement agencies from around the world. Phil and William explain the intricacies of crypto tracing, international law enforcement collaboration, and the innovative tactics used to shut down LockBit. This is a riveting look inside of one of the most significant crypto ransomware operations to date, and we talk about the ripple effects on the larger cybercrime ecosystem. Now, there's so many stories just like the one that we explore today that never get told in public. So before we jump into the episode, I just want to congratulate the amazing winners of our inaugural Chainalysis Customer Awards that were presented at the Trace DC conference this past July. We awarded our public sector customers in a variety of categories, including innovation, cross-border collaboration, bridge building, and case of the year. To find out all about the winners' stories, just follow down to the show notes, click on the link to read the blog with all the details. And now, on to our episode. I'm very excited to bring you a special show. We're going to talk deep on ransomware. I've got Will Lyne, who's the head of cyber intelligence at the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom, and my colleague Phil Larratt, who is director of investigations, works across the UK and the European continent with some of our most important strategic customers. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
Morning, Ian. Thanks for having us.
You know, we've been trying to schedule this for months, so I am pumped to talk about this today. Will, before we jump into ransomware specifics, you've got a super interesting background. As I usually do, I was doing a little bit of LinkedIn stalking this morning before the show, and you've got a degree in Astro-Physics, and now you're in the line of police work, focusing on cybercrime. Maybe just a brief background on how you went from Astro-Physics to where you are today.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm using my degree a whole amount of time in my current role, but I went to university. It feels like a million years ago now, and kind of like I wanted to be a scientist. I was really interested in kind of like that topic, astrophysics, but didn't take long of actually being at university to realise that actually that probably wasn't the life for me. But really enjoyed it. Really fascinating kind of degree to do. But when I finished, I've always just been guided by doing stuff that's really interesting. For me, life and what you do is all about that Sunday evening feeling. And I kind of just stumbled into my current role. Really saw it, thought it looked really interesting, and applied, and kind of like that was my route into law enforcement. There was no kind of preconceived plan. I'd never kind of dreamt of being in law enforcement or being in the police, but stumbled into it. But yeah, since I guess kind of like fate led me down that road, I've loved every minute of it. It's been a really varied and fascinating career.
And talk a little bit about your unit, the National Cybercrime Unit within the NCA, for people that maybe aren't familiar with UK law enforcement structure, kind of responsibilities and focus of your organization, and then what do you specifically do as head of cyber intelligence?
So the NCA, so National Crime Agency, as you say, is a little bit like federal law enforcement in the UK. So I have a national remit, and we lead on SOC, or serious organised crime. The agency more broadly is kind of 5,500 people, something like that. The National Cybercrime Unit, in comparison, which is where I work, it's relatively small. It's only about 300 people, and we're really focused on what can be described as pure cybercrime or cyber-dependent crimes. So the types of offences that you can generally only commit with a computer. So, ransomware is a really obvious example of that, and there's lots of others. I'd appreciate that kind of definition is a little bit outdated now. Actually, kind of, lots of offending happens on this kind of spectrum, but that's specifically the remit of the National Cybercrime Unit. And yeah, my role is to lead the intelligence function on cyber for the agency, which is a really varied and really fascinating job.
Amazing. We're going to get more into the job itself. But Phil, I don't want to forget about you. You and Will actually worked together for a number of years, but you've been here at Chainalysis for about 3 years. Talk a little bit about the transition from policing into the private sector and what you do here at Chainalysis.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So yeah, I left the National Crime Agency about 3.5 years ago. And so prior to that, I'd spent 12, 13 years in UK law enforcement. So at Greater Manchester Police and then at the National Crime Agency. Now I've been in crypto investigations for over a decade, so since the start of 2014. And that took up a lot of my role at the National Crime Agency, working with Will in cybercrime, particularly around ransomware. So in terms of the transition, yeah, I decided to make the jump like 3.5 years ago. Now, in terms of my role now, I'm the Director of Investigations, so at Chainalysis, and that's on the international team, so anything outside of the US. And I manage a team of investigators who provide specialist support to both the public and the private sector across the world. Now, what I would say is in terms of my role in the private sector, it's probably as close as I could be to the public sector without actually being in the public sector. So we work very closely with partners from across different agencies across the world, and like I say, providing that sort of specialist and advanced support in relation to crypto investigations.
Amazing. Now, I have a note here that you were involved in an investigation, £100 million Vishing fraud case that ran between 2014 and 16. I have to admit, I'd never heard the term vishing before. Can you unpack that one for us? What was this all about?
Yeah, I mean, the term phishing, it was new to me at the time as well. It's essentially phishing, but with voice calls, so they call it phishing. And yeah, there was a big case back in like 2013, 2014 in the UK, essentially an organized crime group that were targeting legal firms, big businesses, using this sort of social engineering techniques, essentially calling up on the phone, purporting to be from the fraud department at various sort of UK banks, and then through a really sort of advanced and very professional sort of approach, they were able to essentially get the sort of required details to log into a victim's online banking platform, and then essentially they dissipate the funds once they had gained access to their bank account. Essentially what they then do is have like a network of money mules across the UK who'd receive these funds, so they did it in different like chunks of payments, and then that'd be sort of layer one, and then they'd have another layer of money mules, that'd be layer two, and then layer three, and then eventually what this crime group would do, working with their sort of professional money launderers, would be to sort of cash all of this money out at banks and at ATMs and get that cash back to the crime group who committed the vishing in the first place, minus obviously all the fees that they paid for these money launderers to layer the proceeds of crime.
Unbelievable. Now, Will, you mentioned that a big part of the focus of your unit is on ransomware. Maybe set some context for listeners. How big a problem is ransomware in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, it's really significant. And I think ransomware went from one of those threats that emerged in kind of like the mid to late 2010s. And it was kind of an issue kind of running in the background. But actually it went really quickly from one of those cybercrime problems that perhaps wasn't an enormous priority for us in law enforcement, all the way through to being a national security issue and the most significant cybersecurity issue facing the UK in a relatively short period of time. But yeah, you only have to look at some of the recent attacks that have been in the media to kind of like recognise how acute the issue of ransomware is in terms of the impact on victims, not just from a financial perspective, but from broad spectrum of harms. RUSI have done some really interesting research in the UK, so there's a think tank in the UK about kind of the harms run much more deeply than just the financial impact on victims. Yeah, huge priority for us within the National Cybercrime Unit, recognising, it is the most significant cybercrime and cybersecurity threat facing most people in the UK.
Well, and I think one of the things that people find so frustrating about ransomware is most of the threat actors seem to reside in Russia, sort of outside of the reach of law enforcement. And so they operate, in many cases, it feels like with impunity, right? They swoop in, they disrupt technology systems of victims, they demand these huge sums of money, which even if you pay them in certain cases, you don't necessarily get resolution of the technology issues. And then there's obviously all this sort of fallout from, victim data being leaked that you have to deal with. So it's a really disruptive crime that doesn't seem to have an easy resolution, but I think your organization led the way in something called Operation Cronos, which is going to be the big focus of our conversation today, against LockBit. So maybe we can start with a bit of background on what LockBit is, and then dive into what is Cronos and what we were actually able to do here.
So LockBit's been around for a number of years and was one of the biggest, if not I think easily the biggest ransomware as a service groups operating out there. So providing a capability for people to come in called affiliates, effectively buy into the ransomware scheme and utilize the capabilities in the platform that LockBit provided as a service to them, in return paying a percentage of the cut of ransoms received. But yeah, LockBit was a really big group and really, really prolific in terms of, you look at the kind of victimization volumes from things like data leak sites and things like that. Many thousands of victims around the world over the time that it was operating.
Phil, maybe you can fill in some details from an on-chain perspective, like when we look at the cryptocurrency payments being made to LockBit or where some of the funds distribute from there. Anything notable that you would add?
Yeah, definitely. So I think like if we look at LockBit and just to what Will said before, it's been active since I think 2020, 2021. It deploys this very successful sort of affiliate model. And if we just take a look at the on-chain data, we can see well over sort of 2,000 different victims who've made payments to LockBit over the course of its life cycle. There's a minimum there of like $120 million worth of payments, but we believe this to be a lot higher. And like I say, it's demonstrated before Operation Cronos a lot of resilience, really. Like, it's been around since 2021. I think its revenue then was around like the 8th highest in terms of the different ransomware variants, and it became more and more sort of successful as a business model. And by sort of 2023 and early 2024, I think it was like the 2nd highest in terms of the revenue that it was ultimately generating. And like Will touched on before, just in terms of how the LockBit model worked, they had hundreds of different affiliates who were sort of buying into the program, using the LockBit malware, and then wreaking havoc and utter devastation to victims, not just in Europe but across the world.
I had an interesting guest on the podcast recently from Kivu Consulting, which is one of the companies that try and help victims of ransomware kind of deal with the fallout and the recovery process. And he had a very interesting stat that said their analysis indicated only about 1/3 of victims actually pay. So if we take your 2,000 victims, we can almost sort of assume that they probably carried out at least 6,000 attacks just on that kind of relative basis. So incredibly prolific given the time frame that we're talking about, just the last few years. So Will, how does your organization decide, okay, LockBit is somebody that we want to go after? Like, where does that prioritization of resources and focus, like, how do they pop up on the radar?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's changed quite a lot over time as the number of ransomware groups has increased. So back when I was working on ransomware with Phil a fair few years ago now, there was probably a relatively small number of significant ransomware groups victimizing people in the UK and around the world at any one point in time. So, Phil almost felt like, a dozen ransomware groups is enough for one organization and enough for one team to be able to track and to be able to put some monitoring around that. But now, as we've seen this threat proliferate, ransomware as a service is a massive part of that in terms of lowering the barrier of entry, and just the sheer number of groups that we see operating nowadays means that, you cannot actively work on dozens and dozens, 50, 70, 80 ransomware groups at once. So, we have an internal prioritization mechanism that draws in data from not just the NCA but from a number of different partners, including industry, that help us prioritize the ones that we really should be focusing on the most. But really difficult, actually, and that is a huge challenge because often these groups kind of like appear out of nowhere a little bit and can rise to prominence really, really quickly in a way that perhaps you don't expect. So predicting or trying to understand which ransomware groups in the future will be a problem, I think is really, really hard. That predictive element is really difficult, and I think that problem is only going to get worse in many respects as we've seen the kind of the market fragment quite significantly. It feels a little bit like the era of kind of like having these really big ransomware affiliate programs and ransomware as a service groups operating, but maybe over. Perhaps I'll be speaking too soon, but are we going to see the likes of Alpha V Black Cat, LockBit, Conti type groups operating again? Maybe not. Many more for us to track and many more for us to prioritize and allocate our resource against.
I wonder if it's similar to what we've seen happen in the darknet market category, where if you're running a relatively small darknet market, it seems like you can get away with it for a period of time. And then once you get very big, like sort of Silk Road or Hydra scale, it just attracts so much attention that it becomes impossible to evade law enforcement. I don't know if maybe that philosophy is bleeding over a little bit into the ransomware world, and so they're intentionally constraining growth to a degree, or maybe it's just the ransomware as a service model model that's encouraging them to splinter.
Yeah, I would say it can feel a little bit like we're entering into this, you could say, post-truth era within this kind of ransomware market or ecosystem, whereby perhaps trust has bottomed out quite a bit in these centralized platforms. Trust in kind of a big affiliate programs has decreased quite significantly on the back of not just law enforcement action, but the action that criminals are taking against themselves, right? When you see exit scams. You mentioned dark markets, Incognito is a really infamous one now in the news about scamming kind of all of the vendors and sellers on that. So yeah, perhaps we are moving into that, I don't know if post-truth is the best way to describe it, right? But, decreased era of trust. And I think that influences some of the behavior of the threat actors online, certainly.
Yeah, that's a great point. If people aren't familiar with Incognito Market, the individual or group of individuals that was running the marketplace, at some point they shut it down and then notified all the buyers and sellers who I believe had been told all their information was anonymous and not being collected, that in fact it was all being collected, all their transaction activity, all the things they bought and sold and where they were sent, and that if they didn't pay a fee, that information would be disclosed publicly, doxing them and all the criminal activity they'd participated in. I imagine that had to bring a bit of a smile to the faces of yourself and people in your team. Well,
unexpected, pretty effective takedown in some respects, but perpetrated by the threat actors themselves.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So let's shift gears and talk about Operation Cronos. So obviously at some point LockBit rises to that level of prioritization where your organization, international law enforcement partners say, we need to do something about this. This is becoming too much of a problem. How do you get started? What is Operation Cronos and what were you able to accomplish?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that kind of all of these threats, virtually all of the activity that we're doing nowadays is worked with our international partners, predominantly those from what you might call the Five Eyes, so US and Australia, Canada, New Zealand, but also with our European partners too. And often that work is through Europol, where there's different task forces, and it's a really great platform for us to come together and engage our international partners. But yeah, that's one of the things about the nature of the cybercrime threat in many respects, isn't it? That what you see and is a priority in the UK is often mirrored by our partners and allies in the West. So what is a really common threat in the UK is a really common threat in the US and is the same in lots of our European partner countries. So coming together often involves that initial starting point is all about that deconfliction, understanding who's doing what and the stages at which investigations might have got to, and then coming together and convalescing really around that common goal, disrupting the threat and delivering the kind of outcomes that we want to. And coming together, as I said, on platforms like Europol is really, really powerful for us to enable us to do that.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, when you think about a takedown operation of something where you've got this large affiliate model, is the idea that if you sort of cut off the people actually distributing malware in this case, that potentially wipes out all the affiliate work, or do you have to somehow plan a targeted action that incorporates all the affiliates as well? Like, take me through as a non-law enforcement professional, kind of what does the operation look like as you're planning to take some disruptive action?
So you're looking at it as a ransomware scheme or as a business model and looking at it its entirety, really. I don't know if I'm going to get my kind of basketball analogy wrong here, but kind of we're really looking for that all-court press to try to stress the network in multiple different points. So not just the ransomware operators and people like LockBit, but also the affiliates. And so looking at it from that end-to-end perspective is really, really important. Looking for those key nodes, looking where we can have kind of maximum impact, and designing the operation around that is massively important. Yeah. So where possible, we go for that kind of all-core press type approach.
Phil, let me bring you back into the conversation a little bit here, because I think given our cryptocurrency tracing capability, this often gives us the map of that affiliate network. Was that the case here with LockBit?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, one of the beauties of blockchain intelligence is its transparency. At the start of this call, I was speaking about an old investigation pre-crypto that I was dealing with over 10 years ago now. And, the funds were layered through different bank accounts. And the only way you could get that information from a bank account was go to court, you get a court order, you serve a subpoena, legal process, you get that information back. Usually, back then it was like by a fax machine. You get that information, you then look at where those funds have gone, and then you go back to court again, you get further information, and then suddenly 2 years has gone, 2 years has passed. With the blockchain, we can do it instantly. And with Chainalysis data, we can see how these affiliates are operating between different ransomware strains. They may use LockBit, but then, for example, they may go and use a different strain. And we can see that we've got a sort of 30,000 foot view of the blockchain. So it's an invaluable tool to fully exploit financial intelligence and see where these funds are going. And look, I spoke to Will on various occasions about like the cybercrime ecosystem. And Will touched on it then in terms of having that kind of whole sort of system approach. And we can see the payments that are being made from victims to these different affiliates and to these different ransomware strains. But we can also see these individuals, these groups making payments to other parts of the ecosystem, whether that be access brokers, infrastructure providers, cybercrime forums, fraud shops, mixing services, so on and so forth. So using Chainalysis, using our data, we can get so much insight, which we can then ultimately utilize to develop intelligence, try and secure evidence, try and take down some of these services, try and seize assets, and so on and so forth.
It's really powerful, isn't it? Because I think crypto is the thing that really revolutionized that cybercrime ecosystem in many respects, and it changed the way a lot of the threat actors are operating, because it not just provides a really good way for you to trade within that ecosystem. Previously to buying and selling things, you are trading amongst criminals. What you're doing is criminal. So how do you introduce trust into that? Well, actually, crypto is is an interesting way for you to be able to purchase things within that ecosystem, or sell things, I should say. So it's really interesting in that perspective, and there's loads of leads and opportunity, as Phil mentioned, in that. But then also kind of crypto transformed that cash out element for, these are financially motivated actors, they're in it for a payout. And previously cashing out cyber criminal schemes, whether it be, going back to, say, for example, the Drydex days, where you are looking to get access to people's bank accounts, you might have had money mules within the jurisdiction where you're going after accounts, who then have to transfer money from that compromised account to their account, and then maybe cash it out, and then maybe purchase some goods, and then perhaps post them back to Moscow, and then sell them on the black market. That's really complicated and expensive to run as a cyber criminal. So you are losing 60 to 80% of your profits by the time you realize them. Whereas crypto allows you to realize that value really, really quickly and efficiently, and much more cheaply than in the past. So that's where it kind of revolutionized and unlocked ransomware as a business model, going after organizations for big payouts. With that opportunity comes opportunity for law enforcement as well, right? So good and bad.
That's right. An advantage for them, but one that I think we've been able to turn back on them in some cases, which is exciting. So with LockBit, your organization was able to actually gain access to some of their systems. Take us through that story.
Yes, so getting access to the data was really an incredible, amazing opportunity for us, the kind of access and insight that in law enforcement we get quite rarely. And loads of crypto opportunity in that as well, actually, I should say. So, you have the crypto addresses that are assigned by the ransomware group. So by LockBit Sup will give you the kind of like crypto address where you're supposed to send your 20% cut of any ransoms that you're making. But then, we have copies of the chats and negotiations. So there's addresses that are provided to victims where in some cases, or quite a few cases, that's where 100% of any ransom payment may have gone to. And there's other nuances to that as well, whereby, if ransoms were over $500,000, you were supposed to actually provide two addresses, and so the ransomware administrators got their 20% cut directly. So kind of like a world of opportunity, not just on the crypto front, but on a lot of other fronts for us. But it's the type of access and insight that is really fascinating, helps us understand that business model more, and really helps us design the most impactful disruptions as well.
I have to imagine that listeners are wondering, how does the government hack into the hackers? What was the means or methodology, if you're able to talk about it, that allowed you to gain access?
So we can't talk about specific tactics or techniques that we utilize, except to say, we were able to fully compromise the data and the platform on which the group was operating, and get access and insight to that for a relatively extended period of time, which then allowed us to aim to protect victims and design the most impactful kind of like international collaborative disruption possible, really.
From what I've read about this, you actually had access to their systems for a long time, with them having no idea that you were on the inside collecting data, collecting information on the entire affiliate network, securing decryption keys. Really kind of an amazing hidden operation. But at some point you made the decision, okay, it's come time to shut this down. What triggers that decision point between allowing it to continue operating where you're presumably collecting valuable intelligence versus we've had enough, we're going to stop these folks from operating?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a number of different factors that lead you to it. But getting the right different operational elements lined up and involved, and being able to bring those all to bear at the right moment is really, really important. So it's always that trade-off. How long do you collect for? How long do you look for? And how long do you wait until you operationalize it? But I think we've really got it at that sweet point. But of course, all of this is about protecting the public as best we're able to, whether that be the public in the UK or overseas. Ransomware incidents, it's not just about paying the ransom or the financial cost. There's a huge, ransomware is an existential threat to lots of those victims. It's utter misery for the people that have to go through it. Has enormous financial, psychological impacts and things like that. So, we always absolutely take a victim-led approach to this as best as possible. So picking that moment, difficult decision, but I think we went at the right time.
I certainly do. I would agree with that. And so when you make that decision to then execute the takedown, take us through what you actually did, because I think there were some pretty public moves here, including a version of Spotify Wrapped that was distributed that I think was just fantastic. If you can talk us through some of those details.
So I think it's actually the culmination of lots of learning over time. So we talked about this absolutely being a collaboration and a coalition of partners. And I think you can see over time our kind of like counter-ransomware approach and methodology. We work really closely with international partners, share learning, share insights, always debrief and, see what's worked and what hasn't from activity that's gone before. And you can see, I think, through 2023, lots of different bits of activity in some way, shapes or form, perhaps include some elements of what we did around LockBit. I think it just came together really powerfully. The technical opportunity to be able to lock out in many respects and utilize their own infrastructure as part of the disruption, I think, was a really powerful idea. And then use those different tabs to put all of the different elements of the disruption in there as they, used to be used for providing data leak sites for victims. We were using those to provide information around what the NCA and the coalition of international law enforcement partners and some industry partners had actually done against them. It didn't take long for Twitter and also X, as I should say now, and lots of other social media platforms to jump in with memes and all sorts of stuff, which was really fun to watch and really good amplification of what we've done in many respects.
I think it was great to combine the technical takedown and the lockout with also some strong, public disincentives for maybe those folks that happen to be outside of the direct reach of law enforcement. You weren't necessarily going to be able to arrest them, but making it clear that you had a tremendous amount of data on them and they were now going to be, on a target list. Kind of trying to discourage that type of behavior in the future, I thought was fantastic.
It absolutely is. We know who they are, we know what they've done, and we're never going to give up working with our international partners, trying to bring them to justice for kind of like the untold misery that they've put upon thousands of victims all around the world. So I think that is a really powerful message, and it's a really important message to impose some cost and risk against those individuals that have perpetrated these crimes. I think is really important.
And most importantly, I think you were able to recover quite a few decryption keys as well. So for people that were still in the midst of a recovery, maybe give them some relief where they're able to get back the locked out systems and data that they weren't able to access.
Yeah, and so, some powerful messaging for victims in there, not just of LockBit, future victims in terms of, when you are paying for extortion-only attacks, for example, your data's not necessarily being deleted. Who would have thought you can't trust cyber criminals? Things like that, I think really powerful, again, in terms of from an impact perspective.
Phil, shifting over to you, maybe we can zoom out a little bit. I know that last year was the biggest year ever that we had seen in terms of ransomware payments. First time it exceeded $1 billion. What have we seen through, kind of first half of 2024, and in light of takedown like LockBit, is that disrupting the overall ecosystem, or is there a bit of a squeezing a balloon effect here where we take down one and activity migrates to maybe some of the other strains, or we see some of the other folks amp up their activity?
I appreciate we're only sort of 7 months into the year, but it is looking like another sort of very strong year for ransomware from sort of a crypto payments perspective. It'd be good to get Will's insight in terms of like the data leaks, but from a payments perspective, it's looking quite similar to last year. Now, I think an important point to note is that ultimately this will probably look quite different from a blockchain analytics perspective, because essentially what LockBit has done, what that disruption has done, and what the Black Cat disruption has done is displace a lot of these affiliates. They may start using, or they are using other types of ransomware to sort of further their attack. Now, it's difficult to measure directly the impact. It is sort of very much kind of a war of attrition with these individuals and with these different crime groups. So I don't want to negate or undermine any of the amazing work that's going on from both the public and the private sector in relation to ransomware. But it's often a case of trying to keep the devil sort of down in the hole, really.
Will, I'm curious your perspective. What's been the experience post takedown? Are you seeing activity spike in other areas? Or are you seeing maybe a decline in terms of attacks, at least temporarily?
I would say from that ecosystem perspective, it absolutely is quite attritional for us. And what we really want to do as the NCA and with our partners is really contest that space much more vigorously than we have perhaps have done in the past. So going after all of the different cybercriminal elements that you need to run a successful ransomware scheme, whether that be access for the info stealers. We've seen some fantastic work coordinated out of Europol under Endgame around that recently, whether it be the monetization of it, whether that be through the ransomware as a service platforms, as LockBit was an example of. But in terms of the disruption, absolutely. So we've seen a decrease from a LockBit perspective. We've seen lots, I think, of efforts to try to maintain the brand and reputation of LockBit that I think is now pretty shot to bits, actually. Lots of really old victims, just duplicating those on the leak site, some claiming some really big victims that actually it's turned out that that's not true, posting some victims relating to other ransomware groups, which has been quite interesting. We just think to try to boost the reputation on there. And there are also the LockBit malware kind of source code is out there as well. So some LockBit victimization that may be reported, obviously it wouldn't be on the leak site potentially, but it might not actually relate to the ransomware as a service group. We are still seeing some attacks, but generally our feeling and some work we're doing at the moment is to try to understand the level of sophistication of those. That our feeling at the moment is that is lower. So the impacts of the Cronos operation we think has been pretty significant. But as I think Phil touched on first answering the question, this is really difficult understanding that measurement of effect piece in the same way that going after and designing and delivering disruptions against these individuals through all the jurisdictional issues and things like that is really challenging. Then understanding the impact is really hard as well. If you have changed behavior, how do you measure that behavior? You have to wait and see how that manifests over time. So we will see how that evolves over the year. And on the scale point, roughly speaking, I think we are tracking kind of like ransomware on a scale at a similar level to we saw in 2023. But I think when you dig down kind of like the next layer of detail into that, it will look a little bit different in terms of the volume of groups operating, for example. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out over the rest of the year.
We're certainly rooting for you here. One question I wanted to ask about, there was some press around a recent law that was passed in the UK allowing for crypto asset seizure, even I believe prior to an arrest of an individual. Has that shifted the landscape a bit in your favor, being able to, when you know that there's illicit proceeds or victim funds sitting in a crypto wallet someplace, does this give you an advantage to when you can gain access to it, obviously, to be able to seize those and take them away from the criminal actors?
Obviously all kind of powers and capabilities that are new to us, obviously really fantastic, and for us to be able to bring to bear in the fight against cybercrime. It would also probably add, it's not just necessarily kind of ransomware and cybercrime we're talking about. That cybercrime ecosystem and crypto is actually utilised and leveraged by a range of different threat actors, whether that be people operating in online fraud, people buying and selling commodities on the internet, particularly drugs. So really fantastic that we now have that additional capability that we're kind of still working through and doing some bits within the NCA, but I think we'll see used a lot more moving forward in the future.
Amazing. We're certainly fans of all the great work that you and your team have done over the years. I'm curious, listeners out there, we have a lot of people from law enforcement or that are in prosecutor roles or other functions within government. What can we do to be helping you be more successful in stopping some of these criminals?
Really good question. I think we are getting better at engaging and working with our partners in the public and private sector. We absolutely recognise that we can't do this alone, and the insight and knowledge that exists out there and the capability that exists out there is really second to none. And so, partnering, collaborating, sharing is a huge part of delivering success in this space. And as I said, no law enforcement organisation or body is kind of like going to be an island in delivering these types of big disruptive operations alone. So there's a number of different routes to engage with us as the NCA, and there's routes to engage at all different levels of the law enforcement system in the UK, whether it be at a force level or regional crime unit level or a national level. So I'd absolutely encourage people to engage and help with the fight.
Wow, I think that's a fantastic place to wrap the conversation. Will, it's been really interesting to have you on the podcast. Phil, thank you for joining me today as an occasional co-host. Gentlemen, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Phil.
Hugely appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to another episode. If you enjoyed what you heard today, do me a favor. Open up your podcast app, rate the show. give us a review, tell us what you liked. Even better, you can share the podcast with your friends. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Chainalysis research team has been extremely busy in 2024, publishing more great content than ever before. In case you've missed any of it, I would recommend you check out our recently released Money Laundering and Cryptocurrency Report, which looks at how criminals are bringing proceeds from real-world crime on-chain to assist with laundering. And with more people around the world expected to vote in 2024, we looked into the intersection of malign interference in crypto. We traced the activity of malign foreign state and non-state actors who are conducting systematic influence campaigns to sow chaos, division, and confusion, and ultimately interfere with democratic institutions and processes. To get access to these reports yourself, we've linked both in the show notes.